Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and in today's video we're going to be talking about what makes the perfect PoE league. So people have been really enjoying these kind of talking videos, so we're going to keep doing them. And today I want to discuss, some of the past leagues, why they've been so good, and what components really do make up an absolute banger of a league. So without further ado, let's get into what I think makes that happen. So first up, accessible content. Believe it or not, I think the most popular leagues have all featured some form of super accessible content that everyone can get in on and have fun on with the new league. So whether that's, the Legion Glacier farming, some Delirium mirror action, everyone can get access to that, and it's all super rewarding for everybody involved. An example of a league that isn't too accessible is, for example, Synthesis. A lot of its league mechanics and stuff like that were very, very advanced. They took a lot of really understanding. You have to go on a database and stuff like that. So I think one of the primary components of a really, really good league is accessibility. And, I think that the prime example of that was Legion. Everyone was having an absolute blast blowing up Legions in Glacier using tailor-made builds, like the Val Icenova and all sorts of stuff like that. And we were all getting in on the action on how many Legions we could do per hour, and that was a lot of fun. Next up, what I think a good league needs is aspirational content. So a really good example of aspirational content is the Delirium Orb. So the Delirium Orb, recently removed for the most part, was the perfect balance of aspirational content, perhaps a little bit on the rewarding side, but it dropped from the mechanic, and it was actually one of the best forms of aspirational content I think we've had, because it added incredible difficulty. Anyone could put them on, and there was different ranges of difficulty as well. It's pretty good, and Delirium also featured the Simulacrum. I don't think that's the best example of aspirational content, but it was also there as well. In addition to that, you've also had aspirational content like the 5 ways in Legion. However, I would argue those are nowhere near as interesting or compelling as the Delirium Orb. And in my opinion, Delirium really did have the best aspirational content, hands down. Next up, every good league, which is an absolute banger, should feature a new boss fight, which is incredibly fun. Delve League was one that comes to mind. He might have been a bit rare, but the Crystal King, Kurgle, all sorts of stuff like that. They were incredibly popular among everyone, and finding them and taking them down was a big achievement for a lot of players. And I think that a new boss fight, which everyone can get hyped about and get involved with, is a massive part of a new league. I think Bestiary comes to mind as well. Back in the day when the new Spirit Beasts were added, that was incredibly exciting, and they featured new crafts, new uniques, which were actually relevant, and all sorts of stuff like that. Which I think is a really, really important thing. And another league which featured this pretty well is Breach League. So when Breach came out, it was pretty much all focused on these endgame bosses, the 5 Breach Lords, getting to do a Chayula and all sorts of stuff like that was incredibly exciting. And again, their uniques were incredibly impactful and very, very rewarding to go after. Next up, new uniques and just uniques in general. So pretty much every league which I can remember, which I had an absolute blast in, featured some new powerful meta item or new unique or some sort of thing like that. So whether it was Incursion with Soul Catcher, spawning all these insane Val builds, or voices in Delirium, again, very, very crazy. Even like something like in the Synthesis League, it's not a unique, but all the Synthesis bases, they did also spawn a slew of different builds, and it was all just very, very exciting. Having something new to build around, to play around with, is incredibly important for a new league. It doesn't need to be more powerful, it just needs to be a different take on the game, and a different direction for all these build creators, and these aspirational, kind of character builds and all sorts of stuff like that to move in. With all those things, it's very, very exciting. And another example of this, while not new uniques, is Legacy League. Legacy League featured the Ancient Reliquary Keys, which in fact allowed you to gain access to pre-nerf uniques. And this spawned a ton of ridiculous builds, and it was incredibly fun to be a part of that. And I think that really, really strong, very, very powerful, meta-defining, build-defining uniques are at the heart of every single good league, and I really am looking forward to seeing more of that in the future. Another good example of this are the Abyss uniques. Tomb Fist, Light Poacher, pre-nerf Light Poacher. Oh my goodness, so much fun. Everyone was strapping on that thing. It was awesome. You could build around it. It was so damn powerful, and it was just really, really exciting to think of all the possibilities with that helmet back in the day, and it was really, really fun. All right, so yeah, amazing new uniques is really, really important, and it needs to get people excited. Next up, new chase builds. So this is kind of piggybacking on the last one here, but basically a new kind of flavor of build to go after. Whether that's the Vaal skills, like I mentioned with Soul Catcher, you know, abyssal stacking, you know, in Abyss League, or any sort of stuff like that. You know, the addition of voices and cluster jewels spawned tons of new builds, and it actually did spawn the kind of assassin, vast power, towering threat, kind of massive AoE explosion kind of builds were spawned in Delirium, and really taking it to the next level. So that was incredibly exciting, and I think there needs to be new chase builds to go after, and that is really, really important. All right, final one here. In my opinion, the last part of the puzzle of a fantastic league is new crafting, item progression, or power. Some really good examples of this are again Delirium with cluster jewels. We've got Synthesis with the synthesizer and synthesized bases, and a lot of other leagues did also feature some pretty interesting ones. I think an example of not so interesting is a Metamorph. Metamorph featured the catalysts. I think this is a poor example of implementing more player power because it's fairly uninspired and uninteresting in my opinion, because it's just a raw stat increase for every single build. Now, I do think an actually interesting implementation of power creep and, you know, item power and progression was Blight. Being able to anoint an additional notable on the tree is actually pretty damn cool. You can do a lot of really cool stuff with this, and when you're now creating your character, you're always considering what you want to anoint, and it's another additional kind of layer of customization that you can have for your character. Whereas catalysts are, in my opinion, fairly boring, and I don't want to see too much more like that if I can help it. Another thing that I think which isn't too interesting is stuff like the Tempering Orb and Armorer's Orb, Tailoring Orb and Tempering Orb from Heist. I think this is, again, a fairly poor implementation of, you know, some sort of new kind of crafting option, because it's really inaccessible, it's really obscure, and it's almost impossible to use on pretty much any item unless you're like a absolute rich boy. Even I don't like to use these items. I think that they're fairly, you know, fairly weird, and I think that these actually need to have a bit of a rework because they're not really used very widely by the player base, and you know, when they are, it's only used by massively wealthy players. So yeah, overall, let's look at the themes. Accessible content with big new stuff that players can try. Very, very important, whether that's a new boss, a new way to craft, a new build to do, or, you know, some new aspirational content. And I want to compare this to what we have right now in Ultimatum, and I think it's interesting to see how many of the boxes are ticked here in terms of the new league and kind of measure it up. So accessible content. Is Ultimatum accessible? Absolutely. Pretty much anyone can get in on the fun and the action, despite the, you know, the one-shots and all sorts of stuff like that. You know, it is a fairly accessible piece of content, and, you know, you can start getting involved and getting really good currency from day dot, even in white maps, and I think that they nailed it there. Aspirational content. So overall, I think the aspirational content is a little bit on the weak side. You know, the inscribed ultimatums, while they do test your character power, you know, all sorts of stuff like that, and they pretty much serve that role, you have to purchase them. That's not a fun experience, and also the actual rewards are fixed. There's not really much to investigate there, and there's also, you know, not too much in the way of profit based on the current market conditions. Obviously, that's subject to change, but overall, I think that they do fulfill a purpose of filling that niche of aspirational content. But when compared to something like the Delirium Orb, which was highly accessible, you know, you didn't really need to trade for it that much when fractured maps were a thing. It's nowhere near as good, in my opinion. Even the 5 ways, I would say, are better than the inscribed ultimatums personally, although the inscribed ultimatums are probably more challenging than a 5-way and also are more risky and kind of get that blood pumping a little bit more. So they're not bad, so it does fulfill the aspirational content niche. Next up, new bosses or boss. So we do have a new boss in Ultimatum. However, I don't think he really serves the purpose of a boss fight like all the Crystal King does. He is kind of a little bit on the trivial side, unless you stack insane modifiers on him and map mods and all sorts of stuff like that. And in addition to that, it's really, really difficult for any player to realistically get a chance at fighting him. And when they do, you know, it's not really a fight you can learn because you only get one shot at him. And, you know, his rewards aren't that insane, in my opinion. You know, overall, I think, you know, while he's not bad, he fills the slot. You know, there is definitely some work to be done there on the bossing front. You know, when you compare it to any of the other leagues, which had, you know, Bestiary, you know, you had Synthesis with a Cortex, all sorts of stuff like that. I think it's a little bit on the weak side. Next up, new uniques or unique. This, in my opinion, is potentially, filled by the new Berserk gloves. I don't know if you guys have seen that. Essentially, it allows Vaal skills to use Rage instead of Vaal Souls. This is exactly the thing that we're looking for. However, I don't think it really fills that niche enough. I don't see enough people getting excited about that build, and I don't think it's powerful enough. I think that those gloves actually should have just applied to all Vaal skills instead of attack Vaal skills. That would have really got people excited and opened up all the possibilities for all the Vaal skills instead of just limiting it to melee slams, essentially, which is what they ended up with, which is a little bit uninspired. I know there's some balancing concerns, but, come on. I think that they really could have pushed the boat out here a little bit more on the ultimatum side of things, on the new PoG uniques, really, really exciting ones. Compared to Voices or Soul Catcher and stuff like that, we're definitely lacking that a little bit there. But good job on the effort side of things. They definitely had the right idea with those gloves. Next up, we got new chase builds. So this one, in my opinion, is the big issue which a lot of people are having. A lot of people are saying, like, I don't have a build that I can do, all sorts of stuff like that. So I think that Ultimatum League needed to introduce some new amazing builds, whether that was in the form of overpowered skill gems with the new skills, or in the form of, a really, really overpowered unique. If those gloves had been global, all mods, you're talking. If they had made the reliquary keys, the Vaal reliquary keys, legacy, now you're talking. You would have had so many more builds. Everyone would have been getting really hyped about, like, doing Vaal skills, doing all sorts of crazy stuff. But, that unfortunately wasn't the direction they decided to take the league in, and we don't have those chase builds, in my opinion, to go after. Next up, new crafting, item progression, and power. So this is another one that, really isn't present in Ultimatum League at all. There's pretty much no new power progression system. There's no new crafting system. And, there's pretty much no form of new power in Ultimatum, which is actually pretty surprising, because pretty much every single league we've had so far has featured some form of, new power. We got the new Atlas bases, but I don't really count them, in my opinion, as part of the Ultimatum League. And overall, I think, even Heist introduced new power in the form of the replica uniques and the replica bases, well, not replica, the experimental bases and all sorts of stuff like that. So Ultimatum, really, they should have come up with a new power system to really get people excited. I don't know what that would have been, but yeah, I think that was definitely something that they should have looked into in terms of this league to get people a lot excited. So overall, Ultimatum hits accessible content, aspirational content, kind of halfway on the bosses. It almost reached the unique thing, just missed it. And they were really missing the chase builds and the crafting and item progression / power. So that's going to be my thoughts on what makes a really, really good unique league, And I think if I had to pick a league which really did fulfill all of them, it would be Delirium. It had the accessible content in the Delirium Mirror. It had aspirational content in Delirium Orbs. It had new bosses / boss in the maps. So it had both the Kosis, Onomatopoeia, and then it also had Simulacrum on top of that. It also had massive new uniques in the form of, the helmet, all of the unique cluster jewels, split personality, voices, all sorts of stuff like that. It had new chase builds in the form of aura stacking and just auras in general and all the stuff that came with cluster jewels. It also had new crafting system item progression in the form of cluster jewels, as I mentioned. And that is just an insane portfolio of additions, which Delirium nailed all of it. And that's why a lot of people will say Delirium is their most favorite league. It had it all. And in the future, I'd really like to see another league which has it all. Because I don't think there's been too many. And if they really do knock it out of the park, I think that we're in for a really good time. So with all that said, guys, hope you guys have enjoyed this style of video. If you continue to enjoy this style, make sure you like and subscribe and maybe comment down below that you're enjoying them. With all that said, guys, see you guys in the next one. Cheers.